Labor history is the history of working people. It's a hidden history, not taught in schools, not seen much in the mass media, and really a suppressed history. It's a dangerous history. Why dangerous? Because if every worker in America knew that history, we would be far more class conscious, far less likely to allow ourselves to be divided from one another when the chips are down. We would understand that despite all the perceived differences of race, ethnicity, national origin, gender, language, occupation, and so forth, as workers, we are all part of the working class and therefore have much more in common than what we think or what we are told divides us.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to UUSF Forum. It's great to see a lot of people back. And we have a great talk for you today. Fred Glass will be speaking about California labor history. Before we go into his presentation, before I introduce him a little bit more detail, just a few things about Forum. So this is a weekly production, almost weekly, of the Human Rights Working Group here at UUSF. I am one of the co-chairs of the Human Rights Working Group, along with Dolores Perez-Halbrun, who is over there, along with Melvin Stark. So thank you to them and a lot of other people that actually collaborate to help bring this to you every week. We have a YouTube channel where these are all being recorded, and we are also sending out an email after the presentations that if you particularly enjoyed it and want to watch it again, or you want to forward it to a friend who missed it and would appreciate it, please take advantage of that. Logistics, okay, the bathroom is just to the left over there, the buffet breakfast over here. We have cards on the seats and on the tables, and if you have questions, we'll take those mostly at the end, so just jot your questions down and I'll be collecting them towards the end of Fred's talk. And I also want to mention that, let's see, we have a sign-up sheet at the door. If you're not getting the emails about Forum, please sign your name and put your email address there, and you'll start getting those. Okay, a couple of other things is just a little statement about how we interact in this space and these meetings. I would like to read this quickly. The intention of this presentation is to hear about various issues in our world today and provide a space where many ideas can be heard and discussed in an atmosphere of dignity and respect for all participants. Therefore, here are our expectations for this conversation. Please don't use language which may be interpreted as demeaning to the speaker, the audience, or other groups. Do participate by raising your hand to be recognized. Identify yourself by name, or there are cards available. Listen and respect to other points of view. Once you have spoken, let others have a chance to speak, and if there's time, you may be called upon to speak again. And that's it. Next week, our presentation is by Calvin Welch. He's a local housing organizer, and he'll be presenting his ideas for solving San Francisco's affordable housing crisis. The week after that, we have Erwin Turtanati from the Open Door Agency, I believe they're called, which provides legal services to people that are needy and not able to pay for expensive attorneys. And the week after that, we have Professor Stephen Zunes from USF, who will be here to talk about US foreign policy, especially as it pertains to the Middle East. And we've got many more beyond that stretching out into Zoom. Okay, with that, I'd like to introduce Willard, who will be doing our Ohlone land recognition.
Good morning. We, the Unitarian Church, acknowledge that we are on unceded ancestral land of the Ramaytush Ohlone people. We honor the Ramaytush Ohlone people commitment to Mother Earth. We also recognize that we are benefiting from living and working in their ancestral homeland. We pay our respect to the ancestors, elders, and Ramaytush community. What I just mentioned talked about the past. If you really want to know about what currently the relatives of the Ramaytush Ohlone community is doing, please go to the Association of Ramaytush Ohlone. Their website has a wonderful array of information, some of their land movement, their cultural resources, and educating the larger community, how the Ramaytush Ohlone people are still thriving and interacting with the larger community.
Thank you, Willard. Our presenter today is Fred Glass. He is the former director of the California Federation of Teachers. He had that role for 30 years, and he is a very long-time labor activist. Taught at CCSF, City College, San Francisco, until just a year ago, I believe. And he directed a 10-part video series that was shown on public TV to a lot of students to educate them about the labor movement, which is a very important part of California history, right? And he's done lots of other publishing, which he may also mention to you when he talks. And he continues to be active in the American Federation of Teachers. So I'd now like to introduce to the podium Fred Glass.
Thank you, Jeff. Let me express my thanks to Jeff Peckrell and the First Unitarian Universalist Society of San Francisco. And good morning to you all here. I retired from teaching, as Jeff said, labor history at City College of San Francisco just a year ago, after 35 years. So it's still very much in my bones, and a pleasure to have the opportunity to talk about one of my favorite topics with you today. And it's a good time for it. The California labor movement is experiencing one of its periodic moments of renewal, with organizing, strikes, and dynamism in both legacy and new industries. The renewal, its possibilities and limits, is rooted in California's labor history. I'm going to divide this talk into 3 parts. It'll be about 35 minutes or so. Labor history, the present day, and a little speculation on what the future might hold for California's working class. There are 2 inescapable things about California history: immigration and the gold rush. They're the center of the mainstream narrative about California, which can be boiled down to 4 words: come here, get rich. It's pretty much the same idea as the American dream of upward mobility, only more concentrated. The gold rush was an indispensable validator of these ideas, though as it turned out, few people actually became rich from the gold rush, or at least from gold mining. But some did, and some became rich in each of the successive gold rushes that the state has experienced: wheat farms, oil, Hollywood movies, the World War II defense industry, and today, Silicon Valley. Or I guess, looking at this image, it's more like yesterday. All these gold rushes drew people from across the country, and indeed the world. And when some people prospered and their stories were publicized, it further fed the mainstream narrative of come here, get rich. But if one side of the coin is gold, there's another that is not. Each gold rush also produced many more workers who did not share much of the wealth that they created with their hands. California today remains, as ever, the state with the highest proportion of immigrants in its population, a little over 25%. Immigration from the outset has continuously remade the California working class. It has always been part of the formula that underlies the ritual pronouncement by our elected officials that if California were a country, we'd be the 5th largest economy in the world. Immigration is a cornerstone of what makes California dynamic. Labor history is the history of working people, immigrant and US-born alike, and their struggle to make a place for themselves in society. It's a hidden history, not taught in schools, not seen much in the mass media, and really a suppressed history. As far as the rulers of our economy and society are concerned, let's call them the 0.1% at the top of the economic pyramid, it's a dangerous history. Why dangerous? Because if every worker in America knew that history, we would be far more class conscious, far less likely to allow ourselves to be divided from one another when the chips are down. We would understand that despite all the perceived differences of race, ethnicity, national origin, gender, language, occupation, and so forth, as workers, we are all part of the working class and therefore have much more in common than what we think or what we are told divides us. Thus, workers and unions always have a choice, inclusive or exclusive. A union is one of the most powerful tools workers have developed on their own behalf. A union is a place to stand together and fight for common interests. It's not magic. It takes hard work, especially in this individualistic capitalist society, to make a union work properly. Like any tool, it can be used well, badly, or not at all. Right from the start in the 19th century, workers forming unions had a choice, either to follow a craft or exclusive model of unionism or an industrial or inclusive model. Big Bill Haywood, a leader of the industrial workers of the world 100 years ago, used to summarize the difference by holding up his hand, fingers spread out, and saying, "The AFL, American Federation of Labor, organizes like this," by which he meant one craft at a time, and each craft separately from the others, even under the same roof of one workplace. Then he would make a fist. "The IWW organizes like this," meaning all the workers in a workplace, no matter what type of work they do, join together in the same union. Thus, the IWW, unlike most of the AFL at that time, organized workers of color and women. Likewise, the CIO, or Congress of Industrial Organizations, in the 1930s and 40s, because it was inclusive, organizing through an industrial model, it functioned as a civil rights movement as well as a labor movement. Not perfectly, but that was its general effect. Within the context of the cultural framing, come here, get rich, this choice determined what was available for the 99% non-lottery winners in California's economy, especially in regard to the immigrant workforce. Let's look at a couple examples of the exclusive and inclusive forms of organizing and their consequences. In 1877, during a terrible economic depression, as bad or worse than the Great Depression of the 1930s, railroad workers were pushed to the wall by round after round of wage cuts, and in response called the first ever national strike. Capital won, but it was an expensive victory. Hundreds of workers across the country were killed by armed guards hired by the railroad corporations, and untold millions of dollars worth of damage were inflicted to corporate properties. In San Francisco, when railroad owners Charles Crocker, Collis Huntington, Leland Stanford, and Mark Hopkins saw what was happening elsewhere, they wisely rescinded the pay cut they had imposed. But other events then unfolded that offer us parallels with today. These men amassed gigantic fortunes. They were the poster children for the enormous economic inequality that arose during the Gilded Age. When the Depression devastated working class communities in the 1870s, there was a backlash. San Francisco's two largest population groups were Irish and Chinese immigrant workers. Out of the fear and anger caused by the economic depression, which threw over 20% of the labor force out of work, emerged the Workingmen's Party of California, which briefly swept to power in local offices across the state. It was a progressive party in some respects. It had a trade union wing that called for working class unity and for free public education, taxing the rich and curbing the power of the railroad corporations. But the main impact of the Workingmen's Party echoed the words of Irish immigrant Dennis Kearney, who preached an ugly anti-Chinese ideology. The party, largely white immigrants, adopted his slogan, "The Chinese must go." The only lasting effect that the party had was the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which banned Chinese immigration for decades. No part of the progressive economic program of the Workingmen's Party that might have benefited all workers was enacted, as workers' legitimate anger over economic inequality was channeled by demagogues into racism, xenophobia, and scapegoating. This anti-Chinese ideology which within a few decades expanded into a general anti-Asian exclusion movement, remained a pillar of California labor politics well into the 20th century. Now let's take a look at inclusive. In Oxnard in 1903, a better outcome emerged from similar elements. Despite the obstacles of race, culture, and language differences that Mexican, Japanese, and Chinese farm workers encountered when wealthy farm owners attempted to pit them against one another, beet workers put together the Japanese-Mexican Labor Alliance, or JMLA, the first farm workers' union in the country. Their unity and determination forced the growers to back down. It's worth noting that Fred Wheeler, who got the all-white Los Angeles Labor Federation to support the JMLA, was a socialist. Besides being president of the local AFL Council and one of the first organizers hired by the California Labor Federation, he was also, a few years later, the first socialist elected to the Los Angeles City Council. Wheeler and socialists like him were much more likely to be fair-minded, inclusive, and anti-racist than non-socialists in the labor movement. Although this was not universally true. For instance, Oakland-based writer Jack London, a fire-eating member of the left wing of the Socialist Party, was also a white supremacist. Our present day, like the 19th century Gilded Age, is a time of enormous and growing economic inequality, which means that immigration has once more become a flashpoint for demagogues who find it more convenient to scapegoat refugees from foreign lands than apply appropriate tax policies to the richest among us, which could easily pay for efficient absorption of the immigrant population alongside other social benefits. Let's jump to the mid-century. Over the past couple years, calls for a general strike against climate change, for safer conditions at work during the pandemic, against racist policing policies, have raised the questions for many, what would that look like, and has such a thing ever happened before? What it looks like is everyone stopping work at the same time, either in a given geographical region like a city, or an industry like steel production or hotels, in order to force those in power to come to terms. And yes, we've had about a dozen citywide general strikes in US history. We've also had national strikes of entire industries. Let's look at a couple of the citywide general strikes that occurred in the Bay Area. The San Francisco General Strike was the most important event in California history that few know about anymore. When I moved to the Bay Area in the mid-70s, it was still within living memory, and you could experience a hush falling over a room of labor activists when someone began their remarks with, "I was there in '34. It grew out of a West Coast-wide strike of maritime workers who were protesting unfair and dangerous working conditions and unlivable wages. The spark came with two strikers, Howard Sperry and Nick Bordois, being murdered by police. After a dramatic silent funeral march up Market Street, no one went to work in San Francisco for 4 days. Out of the strike emerged one of San Francisco's most important labor leaders, Harry Bridges. 3 things resulted. First, the maritime unions were recognized by the employers. Maritime workers got hiring halls that they controlled, substantial wage increases, and they were able to become part of respectable society. Homeowners send their kids to college, and so on. The second thing was national in its impact. The San Francisco General Strike and others like it that year in Toledo, Minneapolis, and a general strike of the textile industry throughout the Northeast and South forced Congress to pass the National Labor Relations Act, or NLRA, a year to the day after Sperry and Bordois were gunned down. The NLRA outlined for the first time general worker rights and the national rules of the game for unions and collective bargaining, which allowed for peaceful conflict resolution in the workplace and gave a boost to union organizing on a grand scale. The third thing the San Francisco general strike did was inspire a generation of workers in the midst of the Great Depression to believe in what they could accomplish when they formed unions and acted collectively on their own behalf. It was a lodestar for industrial unionism. The largest wave of strikes in U.S. history occurred a dozen years later, in 1946, including 6 citywide general strikes, the last of which took place in December in Oakland. That one started with a couple walkouts of department store workers downtown on Broadway, with the mostly female retail workforce seeking union recognition. After police violence, the Alameda County Labor Council voted to support the women with a general strike, which lasted 2.5 days. Not as dramatic or deadly as the San Francisco general strike, it nonetheless resulted in union recognition in one of the stores and a change in city policies, with pro-union candidates getting elected to the Oakland City Council for the first time in decades. This moment on the edge of the Cold War and McCarthyism brought to a close the era of mass strikes and direct action that built the modern American labor movement. When I was working for the California Federation of Teachers, I often heard from more conservative members that they appreciated the union's efforts to improve salaries and working conditions through collective bargaining. But, they said, the union should steer clear of strikes, organizing the unorganized, politics, and legislation. As should by now be obvious, a union without these tools wouldn't be much of a union. This constricted view, which is a variant of the exclusive approach to unionism, is uninformed by actual labor history. Right from the beginning, in California, the first recorded strike took place in 1849, when San Francisco carpenters protested against wages falling behind the cost of living. The first union was organized by typographical workers in 1850, the same year as the first labor political action, when San Francisco Teamsters elected a member to the Board of Supervisors to represent their interests. And by 1853, the first protective labor law was passed by the state legislature, limiting hours of work to 10 in a day. The moral of the story: collective bargaining does not stand alone. What can be won at the bargaining table can be taken away through politics and legislation. If anyone doubts that, look at what has happened in places like Wisconsin in recent years under Republican-controlled state governments, with the destruction of workers' union rights. So bargaining, strikes, organizing, legislation, and politics are all important elements of the union toolbox, and without any one of them, unions and workers find themselves with less power. Unions are all about a larger share of the economic pie for working people. In the workplace, gaining that bigger share happens through collective bargaining, whatever needs to be done to support it. In politics, unions have led the way to more fair tax policies, extracting local and state revenue streams from corporations and the wealthy to pay for the public services that we all need and use. Recent examples include Prop 30 in 2012, and its renewal with Prop 55 in 2016, statewide ballot measures that bumped income taxes on the richest Californians by 1 to 3%, resulting in $7 to $9 billion a year for schools and other public services. It will continue to be in effect through 2030. The taxpayers affected by Prop 30 and Prop 55, people making over $700,000 a year, don't even feel it. And without these ballot measures, the state public sector would be in far worse shape than it is. A local example of progressive tax policy was Prop W in 2016, put on the San Francisco ballot by a union-led community coalition, which allowed City College to become free to residents, paid for by a 0.25% increase in the real estate transfer tax on properties worth more than $5 million. From the 1980s until just recently, California unions, like their counterparts elsewhere in the country, leaned much more toward politics and legislation than militant direct action. Labor laws like the National Labor Relations Act have been chipped away through legislation in the courts from their original intent, which was to level the playing field between bosses and workers in the workplace. As you can see in this chart, with the blue line union membership rate and red line middle-class share of total income, the power of organized employers grew and that of organized workers shrank, resulting in fewer strikes and restricting the ability of union organizing to keep up with expansion of the workforce. But these dynamics have been changing. Appropriately, immigrant workers and organized labor's attitude toward them represented a significant part of this change. Starting in the 1990s, the Los Angeles County Federation of Labor, led by a former farm worker organizer, Miguel Contreras, made organizing immigrant workers a high priority. And once organized in the workplace, immigrant workers were invited into citizenship programs and turned into voters. Campaigns like Justice for Janitors brought tens of thousands of immigrant workers out of the shadows and into unions and civic life, providing a bright spot for organizing in a difficult era for unions and a counterweight to xenophobic ballot measures like Prop 187, seeking to deny immigrant workers access to schooling and services. Since that time, immigrant and second-generation workers have ascended to substantial positions of leadership in California unions and politics. After decades of playing workplace defense, 2018 and 2019 saw the biggest national jump in person hours on strike since the 1980s. Most visible were strikes in red states, which were, in essence, general strikes of public education. They represented the spread of resistance to austerity and Trumpism from the legal and electoral realms to the workplace. The militancy spilled over into many other states, including California, notably strikes of education workers in LA, Sacramento, Oakland, and elsewhere. Educators were not alone. Tens of thousands of hotel and grocery workers, workers at farm equipment factories and food production facilities were on strike at the same time. And during COVID, hundreds of work stoppages, many spontaneous, occurred over unsafe workplace conditions, often in non-union workplaces. We have been seeing new unions forming, too. In journalism, for instance, at the historically anti-union LA Times. Tech workers, museum employees, NGO workers. The organizing is not yet at the scale of private sector organizing in the 1930s or public sector unionization in the 60s and 70s, but nonetheless quite significant. Retail workers in particular, like in hundreds of Starbucks locations, a number of Trader Joe's, REI, and elsewhere, even the first union in the heart of the beast, Amazon, have been organizing since COVID. In addition to the organizing energy among immigrant workers, a growing number of young people consider themselves to be socialists, and in exploring those politics, have turned to look to unionism for tactics and strategies to make this society a better place to live. And I'm sure whatever our politics, we all agree this is a society and world that could be improved on. We are facing concurrent crises of climate change, structural racism, and vast economic inequalities. So where is this all going? The last 15 months finds California's working class in the front ranks of a national revival of the labor movement. The upsurge got a jump start with the University of California academic workers' strike in late 2022. With 48,000 members of the United Auto Workers, grad students, walking the lines at all 10 campuses, it was the biggest in academic labor history, and so successful, with considerable wage increases, tuition waivers, and other improvements, that it inspired a spate of copycat strikes around the country. 20,000 classified workers in the Los Angeles Unified School District, members of SEIU Local 99, struck for 3 days in February 2023, winning a 30% raise for the lowest paid workers in the district. The secret ingredient to the union's success? Full-on solidarity from United Teachers Los Angeles, who left their classrooms to honor the picket lines of their support workers. In Hollywood, the Writers Guild of America, WGA, and Screen Actors Guild, SAG-AFTRA, representing 175,000 Writers and actors had to strike against the arrogant movie studio bosses, and these were long ones, with WGA out on the lines for 5 months and the actors for 4. Determined to gain pioneering protections against potential damage to their livelihoods from advancing artificial intelligence and make up for years of inflation, movie workers received unprecedented solidarity from other workers as they outlasted the wealthy and powerful movie studios. The list of walkouts is quite extensive. Hotel workers, healthcare workers, California State University professors, and more all hit the bricks last year and early this year. In some ways, the most important strike of last year had minimal impact in California. The high-profile National United Auto Workers walkout during Big Three negotiations, which ended with the industrial union clawing back concessions given up by previous union leaders, only affected a few parts suppliers in this state. We once had a half dozen auto plants. At one point, California, up until the early 1980s, had more auto production than anywhere in the country outside of Detroit. Not now. But the UAW, with a new militant and class-conscious leadership, took on the Big Three auto corporations and won big. Immediately after the strike, the union announced its intent to organize non-union automakers. Those organizing drives are underway now. In all, last year saw more than 500,000 workers on strike, and another 350,000 more in the Teamsters Union, also under new leadership, came very close to shuttering UPS before signing a deal acknowledged even by critics as the best for workers in a quarter century. Let's take a breath and assess what all this forward motion means. It's not just about the dollars and cents, although that's important. It's also sending a message that the game has to change. Giant profits for the already wealthy while the rest of us get austerity is no longer acceptable. But while the recent wave of militancy places important segments of the California working class in a better position than they have known for years, I don't want to oversell the gains. The 2.5 million California workers in unions today comprise just 16% of the workforce, about half of what union density looked like 40 years ago. Union workers make on average a premium of about 14% more than non-union workers in similar jobs. But in one of the most expensive states in the nation to live in, it's still a struggle. The 500,000 workers on strike in the country last year were the most in years, but those numbers don't come close to the historic peak strike year of 1946, when with a much smaller workforce, more than 4 million workers went out on the streets. And despite the wins we've detailed here, the forces arrayed against unions remain determined and powerful. Anti-union corporations like Uber and Lyft are warping state and local politics to oppose pro-worker legislation, ballot measures, and candidates for public office. Employer groups like the Chamber of Commerce and Business Roundtable work with right-wing organizations like the Jarvis Taxpayers Association to keep taxes on businesses low, profits high, and public services underfunded. The huge profits that send billionaires into space and give them far too much power can and should be taxed at much higher rates in order to take care of our problems here on Earth. Corporate income taxes used to provide 1/8 of the state's budget revenue. Now it's less than 1/10. That difference is $5 or $6 billion a year. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. The big tech firms park hundreds of billions, yes, hundreds of billions of dollars offshore in tax havens. That's all money that should be adequately taxed for the needs of ordinary Californians. Worried about the unhoused, crime in the streets of San Francisco, as was all over the election last week? Don't blame the victims. Blame the tax dodgers. When unions manage to organize and unite, they get things done for workers. That's one of the enduring meanings of solidarity. When it happens, that power is recognized by the public. The combination of deteriorating economic prospects for millennials and Gen Z, on the one hand, and a militant labor movement that delivers the goods for its members, on the other, is showing up as the strongest public opinion in favor of unions in half a century. But unions aren't always united. Jurisdictional and political differences often conspire to keep unions from acting in their common interests. It's in everyone's interest to address the climate crisis, but without solid social policies in place to provide workers in fossil fuel-based industries with retraining and jobs with equivalent incomes, it's hard to move unions representing workers in those industries on board a green transition. Union leaders have to get a lot more serious about talking with one another and with their members about these issues and how to make the necessary changes happen, because they are existential issues, and they are not the only ones. I'm sure you've noticed that we're in another gold rush as tech swings in the direction of AI. I was driving in from Berkeley this morning on the freeway and noticed that that corridor of all of those billboards that surround the freeway, every other one, these giant billboards, it's all about AI. California is the artificial intelligence center of the country, arguably the world. But this gold rush may have some different implications compared to previous ones. In the past, major technological innovation has often generated more jobs than it eliminated. Today, despite huge investments in AI, things are moving in the opposite direction. California's unemployment rate at 5% is higher than most of the rest of the country. Some of that is a slow return to work in Hollywood, but most of it comes from huge layoffs in tech, where the major companies have laid off 250,000 workers in the last year. Partially that's due to automating coding and other functions, but mostly it's the desire to drive up stock prices for shareholders who love layoffs. However, this may become the shape of the future once AI takes hold. The prospect of AI raises many questions. Among them, if we have a permanent job displacement on a large scale, leading to a working class with a larger ongoing reserve army of labor, what will those unemployed workers do? What will society do with them? And what do you think? Is this an AI-generated image here? If AI can crack the biggest employment sectors like healthcare and education, unlike in the tech sector, these are among the biggest bastions of unionized employment. What kind of protections can unions offer their members as AI eliminates their jobs? These questions arise alongside more traditional ones like, how long can the current big moment for labor last when it runs up against the next recession? We can't answer these questions yet, but labor history has seen similar moments. As long as workers face unfair employers in a system that's stacked in favor of capital, class conflict will continue to ignite. In other words, labor history continues to be made today. And I'm going out on a limb here, will continue tomorrow, as immigrants come to California chasing the latest gold rush. Let me close with an anecdote from the annals of the International Longshore and Warehouse Union, whose headquarters we're right across the street from. In the late 1950s, the union, due to its strategic position within the distribution centers of the economy, boasted some of the best wages and salaries for industrial workers in the country, as it does to this day. But change was coming. The shipping companies and manufacturers were demanding of the union's leader, Harry Bridges, that he negotiate the automation of the docks through giant cranes and containerization of cargo. The union membership understood these changes would mean fewer jobs. But thanks to the living memory of the 1934 maritime and general strikes, the companies knew that they had to proceed cautiously. After debating the issues for 2 years, the members approved a set of conditions for the changes that the companies agreed to. Yes, fewer jobs, but strong protections for the ones that remained, and bigger pensions and lifetime health care for the workers who chose to retire. a large slice for the workers of increased profits resulting from mechanization. In 1960, an important key to fulfilling the promise instead of the threat of an economy increasingly reliant upon machines was worker power, exercised through collective bargaining. As Bridges put it, what of the future then of this mechanization agreement? Only time will tell, that is, time and the continuance of strong, united unions. These words are as relevant today as when Bridges uttered them. Beyond the fragments I have assembled for you today, there are much deeper stories in the history that speak to us and may provide clues for today and the future. If I've piqued your interest and you want to know more about California labor history, moment of shameless self-promotion, here's my book, which you can find on the University of California Press website. Thanks for listening. Let's have some discussion.
First question comes from Art Persinko, who has taken your class, says it's very excellent. And how can we better educate today's workers about unions and their potential benefits to improve all our lives? And in particular, he asks, why isn't Labor Day being used more effectively to raise awareness and form unions and encourage people to form unions where they don't exist already?
Well, bad news and good news. The bad news is that many years ago, I approached the national president of the American Federation of Teachers with a resolution that we were bringing to the California Federation of Teachers, were bringing to the National Convention. And I asked if he, Ed McElroy, would support our resolution, which called for the National AFT to work with the AFL-CIO and the National Education Association and the Labor Department in order to create a national labor in the schools program where we would go state by state and ask the legislatures to pass legislation that would support curriculum teaching kids about their rights in the workplace and about the history of labor. And he looked at me with a little twinkle in his eye and he said, Fred, I'll be happy to support that. I think the entire exec council of the AFT will support that. Why? Labor education is every labor leader's second favorite topic. By which he meant he did support it, and labor leaders generally do. But there's always something on the front burner going on that bumps it to the back burner. Labor movement under attack for many years, that's what happens. Now, so that's the bad news, that's the general context. The good news is that here in California, in the last legislative session, the legislature passed and the governor signed AB 800. You can look that up on the web, what it is and does. It does two things. It requires any student asking for a work permit, which you have to get when you're in high school in order to be able to work during the school year. Every single student looking for the work permit has to be given a list of all their rights in the workplace and ways to understand them written in plain, accessible language. So that's new, that's good. It means we'll have a little bit more understanding. Some people will just toss it in their backpack. Some people, though, will read it and understand it, and they'll be able to fight for their rights if they're not being given them. The second thing that it did was that it calls for the first week in May to be essentially a labor week in schools. And curriculum is being developed right now that will be put on the Department of Education website. And the Secretary of Education in California, Tony Thurmond, is instructed by this legislation to publicize this to all the school districts. So there's some good news on that front. Probably not as good as it would be if this was fully woven into the curriculum as it should be, but it's a step and it's happening now.
What does the term labor mean? In particular, does it include software engineers making six figures? And I'd just like to tack onto this another comment, which is like that statement which is supposed to be on the break room walls, which is similar to what you said the kids are given in the work permit program. I work at a tech company and I don't see that posted in the break room. Isn't it by law supposed to be there to inform all workers, even software engineers, about their labor rights?
Yeah, it is supposed to be posted. But if nobody is complaining and workers aren't complaining collectively, corporations can just ignore it. There's very little enforcement of labor rights in California in the workplace unless there is action by the workers in that workplace calling for it. It's estimated that, this is an old statistic, it's probably even worse now, but to inspect every workplace in California with 100 workers or more, it would take Cal OSHA 75 years. So it only happens when it's called for. And was that?
That was part of it. What do you see as the organizing potential for the software sector, basically?
Oh, right. And then also the question about what is labor?
Yeah.
And so let me do that first. It's a multivalent word. It means, on the one hand, the work that takes place anywhere. On the other hand, it's usually synonymous with organized labor in the context of talking about unions in the workplace. So it's a double meaning. And then in terms of tech workers and their $600,000 a year figures, well, that's being driven down at this very moment. That's what those layoffs in tech mean. It means that the heads of the corporations have realized maybe they're paying out a little too much money for their profits good to all these tech workers. And so they're reducing that load of wages being paid rather extravagantly at some levels to the workforce. I think workers who get hundreds of thousands of dollars a year while the corporations are making hundreds of billions of dollars, they're entitled to a fair day's wage for a fair day's work. Not so good for the housing costs in the Bay Area, say. But as to whether they're workers, yes. As the 250,000 of them who have been bounced out of work over the last year or so have come to recognize they are wage laborers, and they depend on selling their labor power in the workplace in order to live. And that, not all of them get 600,000 a year. I know quite a few tech workers through my kids who are in their 30s and their friends. And, they were making good money, way more money than I ever made, fresh out of college. More power to them. But some of them are now couch surfing. And, if you're out of work for 3 months or 6 months, even if you were making $200,000 a year, here, where it's so expensive to live that the most recent figure I read was something like $175,000 is the median salary in San Francisco. Those numbers don't mean today what they once did, given the context of inflation, especially in housing prices. So yes, they're workers.
Okay, now thinking about farm workers, it's my understanding that a growing section of farm workers are H-2A bracero. Could you talk about what role this contract labor program is playing now in the border frenzy being whipped up in the election campaign of the two capitalist parties?
Similar to the bracero program, which was in place in the country from the 1940s to the 1960s. The purpose of these programs, like this immigrant worker programs, is to divide workers from one another and to create a wedge against unionization. It's good for workers to be able to get work here in this country when they come in from other places, but generally there are limits on what can happen then with their residency, and in many cases they can be sent away pretty quickly. In terms of, therefore, what's happening with the border crisis, it feeds into the narrative of, they're coming to take your jobs. And so we have plenty of both jobs to go around for the most part. And in those moments when we don't, because the capitalist economy constricts, then there are other solutions to our problems than putting walls up on borders. As I mentioned a few times in my talk, because I'm very serious about this, people need to pay more attention to tax policy. The tax policies that allow corporations and the rich to get away, literally with murder, need to be changed. And it's not as if this would be brand new. All we have to do is look at tax history in this country, and there were times when our policies were much more progressive. And we need to return to those policies whereby, in the 1950s, under Eisenhower, top marginal tax rates, income tax rates, were 92%. So if you were, and of course I'm talking about brackets, right? So it's not 92% of the entire income of a rich person, but rather of the amount that they make above a certain level, right? Different brackets have different tax assessments. But if we were to do that again, or have a wealth tax, something that was called for in the excellent book by Thomas Piketty, Capital in the 21st Century, a few years back, they wouldn't feel it. They'd still have their 7 mansions and 4 yachts and 3 jets, and they could easily pay 2% of their wealth each year and stay in that same position. And then we would have a whole lot more for everybody in the society, including immigrants.
How much of a problem is corruption in labor unions? For example, labor leaders enriching themselves with member union dues.
So this has always been something that was seized upon by the employing class as a way to warn workers off of unions. And it is a problem. There are some unions in which that happens. Most famously, the Teamsters Union from the 1950s to the 1970s or so, they were outside the AFL-CIO, tossed out because of the bad publicity that they rightfully were getting for having corrupt leadership. And it happens to the present day, but the good news is that, for instance, in the United Auto Workers, which was once one of the most progressive workers for half a century in the American labor movement, over the last 20 years or so, they had corrupt leaders too that were in bed with the people they were negotiating with on the other side. They are now in prison. And the new leadership of the UAW, as my presentation gave you a little glimpse into that, they're quite militant. And they are pure as the driven snow, at least so far. So we'll see what happens. But this is mainly, talking about union corruption, it's mainly a look over there by the ruling class so that workers don't organize into them.
We have a question about the Green New Deal, which I don't hear about as much lately. I don't know what the Biden administration's position on it is, but it includes a just transition for labor to make the transition without as much hardship. Could that just transition idea help workers, especially in an AI economy?
Absolutely. That's something that the Republicans were determined in Congress to be blocking, and they have successfully done so. It was folded into the earlier proposals by Biden for his big economic programs, and it was killed by the deadlock in Congress. And it was killed by 2 people, right? Kirsten Sinema and Joe Manchin. Biden likes to present himself as the most pro-union labor president in history. And he's actually right. No president has ever shown up on a picket line before like he did with the United Auto Workers. The people that he appointed to head the National Labor Relations Board were crucial to the success of things like the last few years, the Starbucks workers organizing drive. The National Labor Relations Board could have killed, like it did through many other administrations, the organizing going on in those places by just denying the unfair labor practices that the workers were filing through the board. And so that it matters who's president for those kinds of appointments. And Biden, he's had a misstep or two around that. He's also had a few other missteps recently around Gaza. But in terms of, his presidency and the labor movement, it's been about as good as it could get given the balance of forces in Congress.
A question about the federal minimum wage. In the richest country in the world, why can't we get the federal minimum wage raised above $7.25 an hour? How can we organize on this?
See my previous comments on tax policy and the Republicans in Congress. Those are the roadblocks to having a decent minimum wage. And so the ways we organize are by building up the labor movement, making the labor movement stronger, because that's the best proponent in Congress and lobbyist in Congress for that kind of raise for the entire working class. The AFL-CIO, as essentially a union of unions, is the way that unions have a way to express their common interests. And they don't just advocate in politics and legislation for their own members. They are often also the force that argues on behalf of the entire working class when they're doing what they're supposed to do. And that's one of the things to me that's heartening about the new leadership in the labor movement and the new militancy that over the last year and a half or so have led all these strikes. If you look at the rhetoric that the leaders are saying during these strikes and around organizing, it's different than it's been since the Cold War. You have people like Sean Fain saying, we are doing this on behalf of our members and on behalf of the entire working class. Those were the kinds of words that couldn't be uttered for a long time within the labor movement for fear of being pegged a communist. And so you have, I forget her name, the woman who's the head of the Screen Actors Guild, Fran Drescher, is that right? She was saying, I'm an anti-capitalist in the midst of that strike. These are things that you weren't hearing for a long, long time. And now it's much more something that's being said. So if we have more class consciousness, if we have more of a labor movement that's class conscious, then we get a bigger minimum wage, I guarantee you.
Now, going back into history, looking at the dates, I wonder how California becoming a state in 1850 affected labor and unions.
I'm sorry?
How did California's becoming a state in the year 1850 was it affected by labor and unions, I think is the question here.
Well, as I mentioned in my talk, there were unions right from the outset in California. First strike in 1849, first union in 1850, first legislation pro and anti-worker within a couple years after that. You didn't have an economy that supported unions until we became a state. It was much more pastoral, no urban centers to speak of. So the gold rush and statehood, which arrived pretty much at the same time, I can't say that this was unidirectional. They all happened at the same time. The unions were there because there was a labor historian, Lucille Eves, who said, workers organized so quickly in California after the gold rush, one must wonder whether or not they conspired on the way out to form the unions. And that was a little fanciful, but it got at what actually happened. People coming to California carried with them organizing traditions from other places, from the East and from other countries. And this was right after the revolutions in Europe of 1848, and people after the repression following the workers who were leaders in that often some came to California. And so those traditions were here right from the beginning for organizing.
Okay, we have a question about red baiting. Conservatives are fond of pointing out that Nazis, something about Selma, Nazis called themselves socialists. How can progressives distinguish themselves from totalitarian socialists?
All right, so that seems a little garbled, but I think what we can tease out here is that It's the other way around in Germany in the 1920s. The Nazis called themselves the National Socialist Party because they were attempting to attract workers. And at that time in Germany, the biggest parties were the Social Democratic Party and the Communist Party. And I'm sure most of the audience here knows that in 1933, Hitler's rise to power was aided by the Communist and Social Democratic parties going at it against each other, hammer and tongs, dividing the vote instead of uniting and stopping Hitler. So, National Socialist Party, that was the name because the Nazis, the fascists, thought they could attract workers that way. Here, the right wing is fond of mushing together communists, socialists, Nazis, and so on. It just means bad names to them, for people that are attempting to work for the common good here instead of on behalf of their favorite people, the 1%. So one just needs to stop and take that argument apart when it happens and say, I don't know about the definition of your terms, but there are very few, if any, fascists in the leadership of the American labor movement. And socialists, maybe even still to this day, communists, sure, there are some of those, there have always been, but we're a democracy and we support the expression of all views within our unions as we do in the society.
There's a question about Cesar Chavez, a history I'm not familiar with. Did he cut costs to 25 cents an hour? I'm not sure who asked this question. Where was Cesar Chavez when we needed him? Cut costs in Mountain View for 25 cents an hour.
I'm not sure what that question means. Chavez was, of course, one of the foremost advocates for agricultural labor in our history. He was a bit better at that for the first 20 years that he was organizing farm workers than he was for the last 20 years. But I don't know what the 25 cents in Mountain View means. Bruce, do you? Oh, okay, let's hear it.
I was born in San Jose. I grew up in Mountain View. And when we were kids, we used to ride our bicycles from Mountain View up Evelyn to Farm Workers Ranch, where we cut apricots in half and put them on trays for 25 cents an hour. That's why I said, where was Cesar Chavez when we needed him? Because we did that for 25 cents an hour.
I'm sorry, what years were you talking about? So where was Cesar Chavez at that point in time? He was in school. Later on, he would have helped out, I'm sure. Well, he was organizing through other organizations than the ones that he founded. The Community Services Organization, CSO, he was their national director for a while in the 50s, and he left them and that position because the CSO didn't want to devote all its resources to organizing farm workers. So he was already doing that organizing in the 50s. Same. She was organizing in the 50s and starting in the CSO. By the way, Chavez was recruited, like me, by Fred Ross Sr., who was a master organizer here in California going back to the 1930s. I like to say that's what Cesar Chavez and I have in common, is that we were both recruited to organizing by Cesar Chavez. By Fred Ross. And, one of us became famous. Although, come to think of it, Cesar Chavez became famous too.
Okay, a question about railroads. What What observations about labor conditions in railways? And could I add to this, like with the new high-speed rail coming in California, will that be unionized?
Probably because almost all the work within rail in the United States is organized. The trouble is, remember Big Bill Haywood's statement about the AFL organizes like this and the IWW organizes like that? Rail unions are AFL unions by and large, and they have a hard time getting along with one another. If they could unite one way or the other, either by forming one mega union or by just talking with each other properly all the time and not worrying so much about their jurisdictions, they'd be a lot better off. We saw what their lack of unity brought them when Biden did the one misstep that I was referring to in regard to labor during this administration, when he had Congress impose a cooling off period on them. They're governed by a different federal law than the National Labor Relations Act, and it allows the president to do that and Congress to do that. So if they're able to figure out their differences, I think that we'll see some better conditions for rail workers, and they could use some better conditions. They're understaffed.
Has labor taken a position on fixed income?
No.
Explain the idea of a fixed income, maybe for people who might not know.
Do you mean a UBI?
I believe that's what it means, yeah.
Universal basic income is an idea that we should also talk about in relationship to artificial intelligence. Because if we're going to be having large displacements of work, then there needs to be a way for these workers to survive. And it would be nice if the economy generated other kinds of good jobs, but if it's not going to do that, then there are other ways to fund their ability to live. And that would be through a universal basic income. We have, in this society, we have plenty of money at the top to be able to support that.
How do workers and their families support themselves during a strike?
In some unions, there are strike funds that come out of union members' dues and support them during the strikes. It's usually not anywhere near what they make on a day-to-day basis in their jobs, but it can be enough to keep them going for the weeks or months that it takes on a strike. Otherwise, they do what they can.
Okay, now we have several questions that relate to the current political climate. I'm going to try to consolidate these or read them together, and then you can figure out how to address them. One is, what do you see happening if Trump were to come to power? Another person asks, what do you think are the prospects for a major civil, even violent conflict with the coming elections, in which MAGA fascists seem unlikely to accept the results if they lose the election? You mentioned that the goal of the top 0.1% to hide the history of union organization. Would the rich be able to do this even if the rich are eaten? And the last one is, could you comment on the SF Labor Council's support of the Israeli assault on Gaza?
I don't know about that. The SF Labor Council supports Israel.
I myself don't know.
Does anybody know?
They refused to even allow a discussion of ceasefire.
Huh. Right up till now.
Yes.
Huh. Well, that's too bad. So, starting with the last one first. I'm a member of DSA, Democratic Socialists of America. And we worked with a number of unions in the Labor Council in Alameda County to put together Bay Area Labor for Palestine. So what the San Francisco Labor Council has done is not what necessarily other labor councils are doing around the conflict. So there are choices. It's like I said at the beginning of the talk. You can be inclusive or exclusive. That choice is always in front of the labor movement, and we always have choices when we make our decisions, whether they're in the workplace or politically for labor. In terms of what we're looking at in November, leading up to it and after it, and January 6th or whatever the date's going to be of the inauguration in 2025. I am quite worried about that, as I'm sure you all are. I was at a meeting of the International Labor Communications Association. This is an organization of people who do the work in the labor movement that I used to do for the California Federation of Teachers. Publications, communications with members and the public and so forth. And I was on a panel, there were about 100 people there, people who do that work. And we've just had this exhilarating conference where one after another, the communicators were talking about their strategies during their recent strikes that helped them to win. This was a very upbeat conference, very different ILCA conferences that I've attended in the past. And I asked the assemblage, how many of you feel that your strategies were effective during your recent strike wave? Everybody in the room raised their hand. I said, how many of you think that there's a danger of fascism after the next national elections? About, I'd say 60% of the room raised their hands. I said, for you, what do you plan to do as labor communicators to prevent that from happening? Nobody had an answer. This is a little worrisome. Now, this was back in December, and so people were still riding on the high, I think, of all of the successful strikes and new organizing that was going on, hadn't yet turned their thoughts probably to the election. But how we communicate between now and then is going to be really important, and who we communicate with. I think, having gone door to door myself and talked with workers in their homes or at their doors during the last election cycle, if you're having conversations with people who identify but not wholly with MAGA and Trump, those conversations can be had. You can turn people. Because he does what the Nazis did in the 1920s. He tries to convince people with his words and his actions that he's on their side, right? He poses. It's what the newspapers call populism. In his case, I think we're all pretty clear. He's a fascist. I wouldn't have said that 8 years ago, but I think we've had ample proof of it ever since. And if you look at what fascism is historically, that's what he and his party have become. There used to be, there are a lot of gray hairs as I look around, mine included here in this room. I'm sure we remember back when the Republican Party included moderates and even liberals, right? We don't have any of those anymore. They've all been driven out. This is part of the path to fascism. So, yes, very worried, but, we have some time to do something about it. Now, after the election, and if Biden wins and Trump refuses to accept the results and calls for an uprising, I think it's going to be a worse uprising than we had this last time. They've had time to think about January 6th, what went wrong for them, and I'm especially worried about the integration of right-wing militias with local police departments around the country. And so I would say that the best thing to do, at least from the position of the labor movement, is to bulk up the labor movement, organize like hell between now and the elections, and talk about things like general strikes. It's a concept that most people don't know about, and it's also something that's been somewhat discredited by ultra-leftists calling for it on every occasion that they can. You need to have certain conditions in place for general strikes to happen. We need to build those conditions, which are larger, stronger working class organizations and leaderships that we elect that are more militant and willing to call for things like that. Those conditions only exist in a few places around the country at this point in time. Calling for a general strike right now is not going to get us one. But we can build those conditions. And that would be something that potentially could change the balance of power against right-wing militias with guns. Just an idea.
Okay, thank you. I think we'll close now.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much. Okay, thank you all for coming today, and I hope we'll see you next Sunday. We have another great presentation for you. We'll have Calvin Welch talking about housing policy in San Francisco. And the week after that, it's Open Door Legal. Erwin Turtanati is our presenter for that. I also want to tell you about a very special event we'll be having on April 7th after church in this room. We're going to be having a benefit for the Jenin Freedom Theater, which is a really significant theater company in the Jenin refugee camp in occupied Palestine. And it's going to be a fundraiser, and we have the guy that's presenting is a comedian, so it should be quite entertaining. He'll be presenting comedy and commentary is how it's being kind of presented. And you'll see some posters about that on the table as you walk out. Take one if you think you know of a place to put one up, because we're really hoping to drive a big attendance for this and also raise some good money for the Jenin Freedom Theater. By the way, they have been nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. So talk to me about the Jenin Freedom Theater. I really think they're a fabulous charity and something that anybody can support, because they are providing a creative outlet for some of the really most oppressed people out there, who are the people living under occupation in Palestine right now. So thank you, and we'll see you next week.
Labor history is the history of working people. It's a hidden history, not taught in schools, not seen much in the mass media, and really a suppressed history. It's a dangerous history. Why dangerous? Because if every worker in America knew that history, we would be far more class conscious, far less likely to allow ourselves to be divided from one another when the chips are down. We would understand that despite all the perceived differences of race, ethnicity, national origin, gender, language, occupation, and so forth, as workers, we are all part of the working class and therefore have much more in common than what we think or what we are told divides us.